How much of this was on purpose? It's a simple question that for most games points to either bad design or a development team with some strange, borderline malicious ideas. But sometimes it's more complicated, and in the case of Mario Sunshine, an awful lot of the game's stages walk a strange line between jank and trolling, often demonstrating both at the same time. I'll start this video with an obvious case study from a fairly infamous level. This is the opening of Yoshi's Fruit Adventure Episode 8 of Ricco Harbor. To summon Yoshi, the player must bring a specific fruit to the Yoshi egg, which for this stage is always a durian. To spawn fruits, the player needs to go back and forth between these two structures, ground pound the button, at which point a random fruit will emerge from the pipe. To complicate things, the player can't just keep mashing the get fruit buttons because the durian is spherical, and will therefore roll off of any fruits that are on the ground already and probably fall into the water or something. So the gameplay loop for this section involves jumping on one of two structures, hitting the get fruit button, and then moving the incorrect fruit out of the way before repeating this dozens of times. And eventually, hopefully, a durian will appear. I wouldn't call this section hard, but I certainly wouldn't call it fun either. You're effectively arguing with a random number generator about how much you're allowed to hatch a dinosaur egg. It is a finicky and somewhat broken introduction to what is ultimately a difficult stage for many more reasons. It's an experience, to put it mildly. The rest of the level involves collecting the Shine Sprite, the central collectible trinket of Mario Sunshine, which here is protected by a yellow gelatinous barrier, a kind of goop, that can only be destroyed by Yoshi's stomach acid. So the player has to navigate Yoshi to the uppermost platform, and along the way, shoot these fish things that create bespoke platforms which will gradually disappear. And if all goes well, you can jump to the final platform, destroy the barrier, and collect the Shine Sprite. Except that isn't really the most approachable way to beat the level. It is technically possible to jump to the final Shine Sprite with Yoshi, but the precision required for the height of the platform and getting a double jump ready with such a short runway is ambitious. It's a greater ask than the game normally makes of the player. So there's this alternate method of shooting from halfway across the platforms, roughly the third one, and destroying it from a safe distance, then coming back with the rocket nozzle without Yoshi. And it's entirely too easy this way, almost like it wasn't supposed to work. And to this day, I don't actually know if this was something the developers intended to make possible. I have my suspicions because they hit a rocket nozzle in the level, but ultimately none of that matters because this is the game as released. This level has a bit of a reputation for being simultaneously too easy and too difficult, depending on which strategy the player uses. Either way feels out of sync with how the rest of the game functions. So to the haters, the detractors, and even the Sunshine fans, of which I am one, Yoshi's Fruit Adventure is a point of friction in the game, and emblematic of Sunshine's overall issues. In my mind, one question comes up over and over: is the stage this hard on purpose, or did it just slip through the cracks and evade any reasonable QA process? Hello and welcome to Computer Lab Hijinks, a show about games, old software, and web ephemera. I'm Nathan, and we've had a bit of a hiatus for the last few months, but we're back now talking about one of my favorite games of all time, Super Mario Sunshine. It's a game that clearly likes messing with its players, but how much of that was intentional? And this question, Mario Sunshine, jank or trolling? We're going to look at 3 case studies in addition to the one we just discussed. We're going to define jank, and we're going to define trolling mechanics or difficulty in games in general. I think it'll be an interesting video that gets to the heart of what games are. So let's dive right in. To begin, let us define jank. And so this comes from Dr. Madison Schmalzer's excellent paper on jank and embodied play. I'll read this section. Quote, a catch-all phrase for a certain kind of weirdness that, while it may be frustrating and often humorous, does not go so far as to make the video game unplayable. And later in this essay she writes, quote, the suite of weirdness that jank describes are actually disconnects between player expectations about how elements of video games should behave and how they actually do. End quote. So I would say that jank is a game doing things other than what the player expects based on either previous elements of the game itself or just other games, and what we've come to expect from the medium. And that brings us, of course, to the lily pad ride. Maybe it's jank. This, for me, is a stage in Mario Sunshine that makes the argument that this game might be a lot of jank. So, to begin the level, much like Yoshi's Fruit Adventure, it involves navigating Yoshi to a difficult place to reach, which is of course this island off the coast of Isle Delfino, and the warp pipe is guarded by our friend, the yellow gelatinous barrier, which requires Yoshi's stomach acid to erode, meaning the player must navigate Yoshi to this island without falling in the water, because of course Yoshi will disintegrate in the water for some reason. So even just to play this level at all, there is an enormous amount of frustration and trial and error involved. But eventually the player will get to the lily pad ride, or the Poison River ride as it's sometimes known, and this level involves collecting 8 red coins by piloting this lily pad that the player must move around by shooting flood in the opposite direction of where they want to go. The water also moves the lily pad on its own, so if the player misses a coin, things get tricky. In essence, it's a physics puzzle inside a game that, if we're being honest, has an incomplete take on real-world physics. It's a hard level, largely for the reasons it's meant to be hard, but on top of all the regular game design stuff, it's also just janky. So in this slow motion clip, you can see me hitting the wall with admittedly too much momentum, but the lily pad, if you look in the close-up, it actually warps positions very suddenly in a way that causes the player character to fall, thus leading to a fail condition. And I'm not saying this in defense of my own gameplay, I'm actually pretty bad at Mario games, but this is evidence of the game's engine producing results that are unexpected. It's a loss that isn't necessarily the result of player input. And so that's all to say, the mechanics of Sunshine are not ideal for this type of level, which is why this kind of physics puzzle only appears a couple of times in the entire game. It's not good, and this isn't exactly the Half-Life 2 engine. So, as I've written on screen here, in all fairness, this is a hard level to get to, so it makes sense that the underlying content is hard, but this is a stage that makes the case, at least for me, that Mario Sunshine has a lot of jank. But Nathan, I hear you say, video games are hard on purpose. This isn't jank, it's just game design. And I would actually agree. And I think it's helpful to consider this quote from Koizumi, director of Mario Sunshine, talking about how FLUDD, the water pack on Mario's back, arguably removed some of the moment-to-moment tension from the game's platforming. So these obstacle course stages or hidden levels were often added into the game to compensate for the mechanical changes that came with the FLUDD device. And so in that sense, I think it's helpful to think about failure as a thing that games do very much on purpose. So our next case study concerns trolling, or Sunshine being obtusely difficult on purpose, and to talk about that, we need to talk about failure. I'm gonna borrow from Jesper Juul's excellent argument, The Art of Failure, a book that is all about how video games make us angry on purpose. And here's a quote that really cracks open the whole argument for me. It's nice and short. Quote, "I dislike failing in games, but I dislike not failing even more." And later in this chapter, Juul argues, quote, "This is the paradox of failure in games. 1, we generally avoid failure. 2, we experience failure when playing games. And 3, we seek out games, although we will experience something that we normally avoid," end quote. And I think this is a really provocative argument. In the same way that horror films make us feel scared, video games give us challenge and let us experience failure in a relatively controlled, safe way. And what I love about Juul's argument is that he specifies this is not a fake experience of failure, this is not a simulation of failure, it's actual failure. When you're doing badly in a video game, you might get actually mad in real life from the contents of the game. And that's an interesting feeling to build a whole medium around. We are drawn to cycles of failure in video games as the main attraction of the medium. That's kinda weird. And so in this next section, I want to look at a particularly hard section of Mario Sunshine with that framework in mind, because failure, in some sense, is the language of video games. So maybe it's trolling. That brings us to our next case study, the Chuckster stage from Pianta Village, Secret of the Village Underside. This is a pretty remarkable stage. So, the player must talk to these NPCs, these self-proclaimed Chucksters, who will throw Mario behind them, but on an angle that reflects Mario's relative position to the NPC. And it's easy to get thrown in the void. I actually think this is a pretty fun level, but it's clearly absurd, clearly being ridiculous, and notably, it doesn't build upon any mechanics that the player would have learned in the rest of the game. There are no other stages where the player must carefully approach an NPC and be aware of their relative position to draw an invisible line through the world. This is a new form of difficulty in the game. And so I think if games are cycles of failure, then this is the level that generates those trial and error moments. It takes a lot of attempts to get through this level, if only because of how weird it is on purpose. It's certainly, in my opinion, a level that is trolling the player, but it is doing so with a level of precision. All of this is on purpose, and it feels like the developers knew exactly what they were doing with such a weird stage. So, the Chuckster stage, in my opinion, embodies the argument that Mario Sunshine is indeed just trolling the player. It makes for an amusing, albeit infamous, level. The lore is nonsense, the mechanics are obtuse and unforgiving for player mistakes, and it'll take you a lot of attempts. There's your failure experience in Mario Sunshine. So the Chuckster stage, maybe it's all just trolling. But let us complicate this whole argument. What if it's both things all at once, jank and trolling in the same level? And that of course brings us to the Gelato Beach Episode 4 infamous level, the Sandbird is Born, better known as the Sandbird level. So this is our final case study, the one that makes it all seem ambiguous. In this level, the player must once again collect 8 red coins from a moving surface, and the level largely takes place on this moving bird made of cubes of sand. So while the bird is moving and flapping its wings, the player must walk around and collect all the red coins without falling off. And a lot of the level's difficulty comes down to this climactic 90-degree rotation where the Sandbird turns fully on its side and the player must walk from one surface to the next without falling off the Sandbird. And if that doesn't sound all that difficult, I would actually agree. It's not the hardest level in the game, but it is one that players complain about a lot, and some of that has to do with the jank. There are unintentional mechanical issues in this level that will occasionally send players falling to their doom without having done anything wrong. For example, using FLUDD in this level or jumping too much can activate some of the weird collision issues in the stage that make it all the more difficult. And the surfaces jump around a bit near the edges of the bird, so if you're near a corner, the game just decides it's your time to fall. The tail also swings quite severely, which was definitely a conscious design choice, but its collision feels imprecise, at the very least. When I started making this video, part of my inspiration was the Sandbird level because of how infamous it is relative to the level of challenge in the stage, which is not all that high. And frankly, I was ready to lay all of that at the feet of content creators, us parasites of the internet, making levels look harder than they actually are, doing our funny Let's Plays where we complain about elements of the game. I was ready to blame content creators for making this level so infamous, even though it's not that difficult. But it turns out I was wrong, and I am ready to admit that I was very wrong there. So I was looking up some genuinely old discussion board posts from around the release of this game, and I found a thread from 2002 of players complaining about the Sandbird. And here's a quote from the end of their post, quote, "Miyamoto screwed up on this one if it doesn't get at least better." It's written in a slightly unusual way, but you can see the argument there. This level is harder than it needs to be. And there's a reply on that same thread, "Why Nintendo, why? It's just plain too hard." And this is from months after the release of the game. This is as early as it gets, long before our modern cycles of Let's Plays and other content creation. People have been declaring this level unfairly difficult from literally the beginning, so who am I to say whose fault that is? It is a level that creates problems for a lot of players. And that is largely from the design of the level. I mean, that climactic 90-degree rotation is hard on purpose, but on top of all of that, you have the mechanical issues in the level, problems with collision and players falling through the cubes. So there's a lot going on in this level, and for me, it's the part of the game that makes the case that Mario Sunshine is both jank and trolling all at once. A miraculous combination, if you will, of the broken and the purposely difficult. And more than anything else, I would argue that the affordance of FLUDD is misguided here. And what I mean by that is that this level is actually easier if you don't jump all that much or use FLUDD, but the fact that FLUDD is in the level makes it seem like you should use them. And I think that's just miscommunication. It's saying something to the player that's not all that helpful in a level that's already hard. So yeah, don't use FLUDD if you're playing this level, but overall, this is both jank and trolling all at once in Mario Sunshine. So, in conclusion, how would I answer the big question of this video? Which one is it? Based on the discourse I've seen around this game, players mostly seem frustrated by jank when it leads to unfair lose conditions. Falling through the cubes in the Sandbird level, for example. And to be clear, no polygonal game has ever had perfect collision. But a heightened level of challenge makes it all the more annoying when the game doesn't hold up its end of the bargain. And I would argue that that somewhat dates the game. It's not what we usually refer to as early 3D, it's not Mario 64 and it's not Resident Evil 1, but it is of an era. At the risk of copping out, it's both jank and trolling. But if I had to pick one, the game's relatively high level of difficulty makes it all the more frustrating when technical issues inevitably arise. So, trolling. So thank you for watching Computer Lab Hijinks. We're trying out a bunch of new stuff on the show. Obviously, I've got this new microphone, we've got on-screen graphics. I'm gonna see how this workflow functions. I think it's an interesting way to make videos, but let me know in the comments what you thought. For Computer Lab Hijinks, I'm Nathan, telling you to keep your files safe, keep your passwords managed, and for goodness sake, don't click on any strange links. Here are my works cited if you want to look through the citations of this video, see if I'm engaging with these ideas in good faith. I'll leave this on screen for another few seconds, but I will also put these in the description if you want to look at them there. Thank you for watching the show, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.